This is the fifth and final lesson on the book of the prophet Isaiah. We've been looking at Isaiah and the relevance of the kingdom of God into Isaiah's prophecy. And so this is the one that ties it all together. And we look at really what the main theme of Isaiah's goal was in the prophecy, and basically what God was saying through Isaiah. So I hope you are blessed by this and are edified and dig into Isaiah and see the relevance of Jesus Christ's incarnation, reason why he came to this earth, and we could see God's providential power in ruling the nations. So this is the fifth and final time in Isaiah. So I thought what I'd do is kind of catch us up, because I know some people have been here every week and some haven't, and kind of give us an overview again of where we've come from to see what Isaiah is saying, or at least the way that I'm interpreting what Isaiah is saying, or the way that it looks. You know, there are some people who write a commentator on just the first 39 chapters, and then there are others who write on the last 27 chapters, because that's where the break comes in Isaiah's message. Everything is judgment. It's sprinkled with a little bit of hope in the first 39 chapters, and it's not until you hit Isaiah 40 that it turns into something that you find some hope in it. And then he starts really talking about the kingdom coming. But before that, everything is establishing that God is king. And again, I think it was last week, or maybe it was the week before, they all kind of run together, that we talked about the message of Isaiah is basically that God is king, that he's in charge, that all these other things that are happening are really not in charge, whether it's Assyria or Babylon. Um, they present formidable threats for the people of God, but they're not in charge. God's in charge. And you could see how this translates into our day and how we're living today, and with all the things that are going on today. You know, the threat to us could be China, could be war somewhere. You know, we've never experienced a world war where, you know, more than a few nations, but it was on every continent around the world. But there's threats of that, you know, and you got to think, you know, was it 70 years um, since World War II? So, or a little more. No, 70, right? 80 almost, I guess. Yeah, 80. So, yeah, so it's a little bit different for us. So, when we looked at Isaiah's message for today, I used this verse from verse 42, chapter 42, where Isaiah says, "This is the Lord speaking. I've kept silent for a long time. I've kept still and restrained myself. Now, like a woman in labor, I will groan, and I will both gasp and pant." So it gives us this picture that God's going to now really express himself. He's going to do something. And this is Isaiah's message again for us. So we looked at major plots, and we looked at that the major plots was that God is holy, unique, and sovereign. And that's one of the themes that you just repeated all the time. And this is an aside, no charge for this at all. When we read, especially the Old Testament, maybe I'm just doing this, but I would normally, when I would read it, I would ask the question, why? did God do that? Right? You see something that, and it just looks like bizarre, or just, why did he do that? And the only way to find out why God does something is you have to ask a question before that. And the question is, what did God do? What exactly did he do in the context of, the 7th century or 8th century before Jesus came? What is it that he did? And then you start to understand why he did it. And you got to, guess what I'm saying is, you got to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and see what was going on there. And several times in Isaiah, God just does things out of to show that he's sovereign. Basically, this is who I am. Yeah. And if you read through the Bible, the Old Testament, if you're reading through a Bible plan, you're probably right in the thick of it right now, tired of man sinning. You just always see these people screw up all the time. But what we see, what you hear people say is that, why is God so angry? Look at what the people are doing. I mean, he gives them the best of everything, and they screw up with it. We do the same thing, right? We get the best of it, and we still screw up. And in the Old Testament, God's anger was kind of on the forefront because the blood has not been shed yet. So you have those two plots that are there: God's holy, unique, and sovereign, and man's sin is especially in Isaiah. You see, God's not happy with the way people are acting, especially in Assyria or in Israel, which is the northern tribes. And during Isaiah's time of prophecy, they get taken into, or they go into the dispersion. They call it the diaspora. That they just get sent all over the Assyrian Empire, and Judah is right on the edge. And I guess it's Hezekiah that gets the green light that he doesn't have to die. And then finally, what we do is we look at God's plan for mankind. In spite of all this, in spite of man's sin, God's still going to show what he's going to do. And we're starting a series in July, end of July, on the big story. Basically, we're going to look at living God's word and how we get the overall picture of what God is doing, and then how we fit into that picture, how we fit into the plan of God in that. And it's the same thing in Isaiah. You've got to see what he's clearly stating what his plan is for mankind. When I say clearly, it's still kind of hidden for us. It's clear when, again, the illustration I've used is that we've seen the horse race, right? We know who wins. And so we can say, oh, yeah, I remember when this horse broke to the outside and started doing this, because I know how this race ends. When you're reading through it, you don't always get that picture. But when we look back, I use this also, that the term Yahweh was the number one noun in Isaiah, and the Lord of armies, or the Lord of hosts. Some translations call it the Lord of hosts. The more recent ones, they're choosing the Lord of armies, and again, it refers to the heavenly hosts, not earthly armies.
Right, that word Yahweh, does that come from I am?
Yeah, Yahweh is the I am. Yeah,
But you're saying Lord.
right. That they translate Adonai as Lord, which is a different word for God. I think even El Shaddai is probably translated as God. And try to think, Elohim is the perhaps most prominent one that's translated God. But as we've looked at that word Elohim, it's not just God that's called Elohim. It's every spirit being is called Elohim. So it's always plural because it's yeah, these are Hebrew words. Yeah, the word Elohim is probably the most dominant Old Testament word translated God. But he's the Elohim of spirits. He's the God of all spirits. So it's nice sidetrack. But the Lord of armies or the Lord of hosts is 62 times it's used just in Isaiah, almost once for every chapter. And then the Lord Yahweh 30 times. So there's the word Adonai or Adonai, Jehovah. That would be the Lord God, is the way that might be translated sometimes.
So that name would not be spoken by the Jews, right? Is that correct? They would just,
They wouldn't write it, but they would say it. Yeah. They wouldn't spell it. They would, yeah. But you got to remember, Old Testament Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, didn't have any vowels. So
it was a name that they never spoke, but I guess that's not true.
Yeah, no, they spoke the name God. Yeah, yeah. So it shows you that Isaiah is really speaking for God. That's what a prophet does. He speaks for God, speaks to the people. The priest brings the people to God. The prophet brings God to the people. Those are two clearest distinctions you can make between priests and prophets. The priests are always the ones representing the people before God, and the prophets are the ones that are bringing God to the people. And Isaiah, has a very big chunk of the Old Testament is Isaiah's prophecy. But I think I said also it's not the longest book, not the wordiest book. Jeremiah has more words than Isaiah. Okay, so another thing that we looked at was that God is unique. He's incomparable. And he says this over and over: I am God, there's none like me, there's no one else. I'm God, and there's none like me. That's his identification. It's probably as close as you get to a propositional statement about God, because it's all poetic language when he talks about himself. Isaiah talks about the eyes of the Lord roaming the earth. What does that mean? God sees everything, right? Could have said God's omnipresent or God's omniscient, but no, poetic language. And when you're saying something poetically, you say the eyes of the Lord roam the earth. Yeah. Okay, so here was our outline, or this was the big outline. The probably the most common one that's used. So from chapter 1 to 39 is the Holy King who must judge. So he has to judge. This is his nature, is that he has to judge. And then the second one is that he comes to reign. That starts in chapter 40 to 55. And we've looked at, again, the high points. I think Tony DeMoro said it really good. He said, well, Ray's doing is giving us a flyover, and then every once in a while he dives down to some things you can't just fly over. You have to go down and take a look at it. So those two separations take us to the week before last, where we looked at chapters 40 to 55. And then these last chapters is basically the summation, or this is what everything Isaiah's been saying, this is what's going to happen now. This is how he's going to bring it to pass. in chapters 56 to 66. God, the warrior king who rules the nations. And this one commentator underlines that word warrior, that he's not just, God's not just throwing hailstones from up in heaven. He comes down to battle. And the picture that you get of a warrior is that he's bloodied from the battle. Not that he's wounded, but he's got, one of the things you realize when someone gets cut, blood goes everywhere. And warriors in their world, if they never got a scratch on them from the enemy, still had blood all over them. Because when you stab somebody, it squirts. And this is the schematic that we used when we looked at when was Isaiah, what was he prophesying to? And you have to discern, when is it in the time of Isaiah? Is he prophesying to those who are going into captivity, including those from Assyria that get taken? Because Isaiah still dresses Israel, even though they're gone. They've been taken away. Is it the coming of Jesus that he's prophesying about when he says, "Unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given"? So there he's prophesying right to the time of Jesus. And he talks about Jesus, especially in chapter 40 and 42, and then in 53, he's talking about Jesus. 49, he calls him the light to the Gentiles, that he's a light to the nations. And what we look at tonight is that he gets into the new heavens and the new earth, that he starts looking at the future now, what's going to happen. In chapter 2, he talks about all the nations were going to stream to the mountain of God, to Zion, that all the nations were going to stream to it. And that's, again, looking forward. It's not looking into his time. It's not looking at the time of Jesus, but this is future that he's talking about. Those first 12 chapters of Isaiah, it's basically almost like a little uh, preview of what's going to happen in the rest of the book. Very interesting. Just the way you could do a study just on the formation of these prophets, on how these things were revealed to them, and just see how that unfolds for us. And this is what we do in the last chapter, because it's a lot of work to do this. I didn't do the work to find this out, but it's called a chiasm. And the chiasm comes from half of an X, basically, just one side of an X. And some people call it a ring prophecy because it goes back to where it starts. So they look at it that way. So these last 10 or 11 chapters, from chapter 56 to 66, is this ring prophecy, or this chiasm. And we looked at it the week before last. Or was it last week? Was it last week? Yeah, I didn't give you what they all meant, though, today. That was for you to go find out what they all meant. So if you see this in a circle, and you start with chapter 56, verses 1 to 8, you end up with chapter 66, 18 to 24. So the message in those first 8 verses is going to be the same as these last 6 verses. It's going to be close enough to where you realize it. And when you're reading, it's always good to just keep notes. And, if you go a little bit past reading and you start to just do observing, you do observation, and you start writing notes. What did I just read? And what you find is that, especially the Old Testament prophets, though the New Testament writers do it as well. The Old Testament prophets, and especially in the Psalms, you see this over and over again, where how we learn is, or how we think is we're the best way to say it is we're a subject verb culture. So a lot of Hebrew doesn't have subjects; it just has verbs, and you have to think who's the subject of this. A subject is the thing doing the action, right? In English grammar, yeah. It's like I said, I think it was last week. I said that Psalm 23 in English, depending on the translation, has over 120 words. In Hebrew, it's half that. So they say the same thing in half the amount of words in Hebrew because most of it is they don't have subjects. So they have a word that will encapsulate a whole phrase, a verbal phrase, and it just be one word that this is what this word means. Where we spell it out with all these different letters and words. So when we look at this, if you do in notes, where I started saying this is that we're a subject verb. So we like propositional statements. We like something to just come out to us clear, but we don't talk like that. We don't talk in propositions all the time. A lot of times we talk metaphorically too. That door closed on me. What does that mean? Couldn't go through, couldn't get this thing. You know, Southerners have all kinds of phrases like that dog don't hunt, right? And that could mean anything. What that means, it just doesn't work. But they'll say that dog don't hunt. You let the cat out of the bag. Why was the cat in the bag? You know, who was keeping a cat in a bag? Isn't that animal cruelty to keep a cat in a bag? But we use phrases like that all the time. But in Hebrew, that's almost like their form of complete communicating, so that it's filled with these things. When you're reading and you hear the mountain of the house of the Lord is going to be raised above all the other mountains, well, that's a picture. Um, the mountain of Zion that the temple was built on in Jerusalem would become higher than all the other mountains. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that somehow God's going to cause an earthquake and make this mountain grow higher than Mount Everest? Yeah? No. And people are going to stream to it, right? And if you notice when you read even in the New Testament, they say they go up to Jerusalem. How? Jerusalem's almost all the way in the south. And most of those people are living in Galilee in the north that are writing about going up to Jerusalem. So what do they mean by that? Do they mean they have to climb the hill to get up there? But no, it was in their mind. This was the chief mountain. This was where God was. So we go up there. We ascend to that. So you have to learn to think like that. So that the letter E in this chiasm, that's the important point that he's making. All these other things are just supportive clauses. They're just supportive ideas. Some of them are more than a chapter long. Letter C goes from the second letter C there goes from chapter 63, verse 7 to 64, verse 12. So there's one thought that you get out of that whole thing, and you have to decipher what the picture is saying. And when you're reading that, see, we would think that chapter 66 is the point of what he's saying, because that's the way we think. We think that he's logically building something here, but when they did something in a chiasm, so they would say chiastically, when they would do that, you would have to find out where the book ends, where are the two things that start and stop this, and then start looking at the steps in between that he's giving to get there. And you can find it in Jesus' teaching. You could find it in the gospel writers. You could Matthew is just one big chiastic story. If you go at it, what does he start with? He starts with Emmanuel, right? What's Emmanuel mean? God with us. What does Jesus tell his disciples at the end? I will be with you always, even to the ends of the earth. And the light bulb goes bing. Oh, bookends. So the writers, this is how they wrote, and this is how they at times even spoke. They would obviously his prophecy has got these things working for him. So when you start reading, you start seeing, oh, this is what he was after the whole time. This is what holds this whole thought together. And what's the punch of it? What's the middle of it saying to us? You got to do the work now. And that's really the way to understand the Bible is, we say, well, you got to put yourself in their setting. That's one part of it. And you have to be able to understand the words that they're using and the way they're using those words, and then understand how the people understood what they were saying. So it takes a little bit of work. Well, it takes a lot of work. Yeah, you don't get this just by reading commentaries, that's for sure. And unfortunately, most churches don't even do these kinds of studies. You think if you're just living on 45 minutes a week in a sermon in church, you're not really getting anything. You're not getting anything that's really helpful anyway. So, any questions before I move on to this? This will making you think, wish I didn't start this. Now I'm convicted. Man.
Every time I read Matthew, I'll be looking for that middle point.
Well, you first got to find the bookends. That's how you do it. Is you find the bookends, and just have one Bible that you just circle everything in, and just start. You could start your own color coded Bible study stuff.
Could you say that the chiastic system is based on thoughts rather than particular words and sentences?
Yeah, it is. It's basically again we think, whether we like it or not, we think propositionally. We think subject, verb, object. There's a person who does this to that, and that's the way we think, and we think that's the way they thought and the way that they wrote. But um, there's some good books to read that really help you with this stuff. Like there's one called Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, and you know, I think I was telling Les last night. I think I mentioned it to him. I'll give you an example. This was from a missionary in Indonesia who was teaching in a Bible school. So part of part of his teaching was he was giving exams, right? And one part of the exams was multiple choice. And he noticed that most of the students left some of the answer. Now, if you're doing a multiple choice, what do you do when you don't know the answer? You guess, right? So he noticed that there were a lot of students who were not filling in questions. And he was just like bewildered. Like, you have a 1 in 4 chance if there's 4 choices to getting the right answer. So he asked one of the students, he said, why did you leave this blank? He said, because I didn't know the answer. And so he said, well, why didn't you guess? He said, because if I got it right, it would make you think that I knew the answer. And that's lying. Now, what's the difference? We're pragmatic. See, we just want to get the right answer, whether we know it or not. We want to get the high mark. They were offended that he would even think that way, because then that would be lying, and that to them it was an ethical question. It was moral to them. See? Now, next time you take an exam, if you're giving an exam, just don't have multiple choice questions. See? But see, we would never think like that. We would think, you have a 1 in 4 chance, and you'll start doing, yeah, what are the odds? You start saying, well, no, it's not that one. No, it's not that one. Right? Yeah, it was in Indonesia. Yeah. There were a lot of, just shows you how people think differently. He tells a story. He was a missionary there for 30 or 40 years. And he said there was a guy who owned 3 miles of beach front on this island, a small island. And another guy from his church owned 3 miles of beachfront on the same island, next to each other. The boundary lines butted up against each other. And the two of them, where would you put your house? If you had 3 miles and you knew there was somebody else who had 3 miles, where would you put your house? Right? As far away as you could, right? If the guy put his house right on the border of the two lines, you'd put your house as far away as you could, right? He said, that's the word right there. In Indonesia, they don't have a word for privacy. So he said when he went to stay with this guy, he said he could reach out of the window and touch the other guy's house. And he said to him, he said, why did you build your house here? He said, you had 3 miles to build your house. He said, because I would be lonely. See, we think lonely is good sometimes. Far away, to them, they don't have a word for privacy. Privacy is not a word in their vocabulary. So because why? They have a collective mentality for family, for church, and everything else. And the idea of being apart would be being lonely. You'd be alone.
Brooklyn, where you grew up, right? It's different, right?
Oh, that's a different story. I mean, you don't have any. They're doing the same thing here. They're just building houses on top of each other. But we have. I mean, Americans are the only ones who have. We have personal space, right? I've been in countries where they will encroach on your personal space. When you're standing there, they'll walk right up to you, like get that far from your nose. They'd be like right here, talking to you, and you start walking backwards because they've invaded your personal space. But there are some people just don't. Some cultures just don't have that at all. So it shows, you have to understand how these people in the New Testament understood these things. When the Philippian jailer got saved, Paul said, you and your household will get saved, right? And then he ends up baptizing all of them, and we take that as a claim. No, they would all get saved because he's the head of the house. And they wouldn't get saved if he didn't get saved. So it's a totally different mentality. It's why it's been so hard to get the gospel into Japan, because the head of the families don't get saved. And so some missionaries hear people say to them, I believe in Jesus, but I can't become a Christian until the head of my family becomes a Christian. And we have a hard time with thinking like that. Yeah, it's a very different world, and our way isn't necessarily the right way. There's a lot of ways that people interpret life and go through life. And I was doing a study on basically just on Jesus has a plan for me. You never heard that before the 60s. When the 60s happened, that became the me generation. And Christians just turned that on to the me generation. And you started, if you go and look and read old writers before the 60s, you will rarely find anybody ever say that the gospel message is, Jesus has a plan for your life. It's not there. Not until the 60s where it became a personal thing. And so that what they took was a cultural movement to where our selfishness became so important to us that we turned the gospel to it. That's why we're saying, no, God doesn't have a plan for your life. He has a plan, and you need to see how you fit into it. That's the right way to approach it. Does God love me? Yeah, He loves me, no question there. But He saved me for His name's sake. Yeah. Get to preaching here now. Just have another altar call. You realize how easy we can screw things up. All right. So to answer Les's question, yeah, these are thoughts that we understand them. So these two verses, these are the first and last. These are the letter A's. Chapter 56, 1 through 8, and chapter 66, 18 through 24. So the first part says, faithful outsiders to be in God's service upon salvation. So look at that, outsiders, non-Jews, non-Israelites. This was Isaiah's message. He's going to be a light to the Gentiles. This is the servant. And the second one is almost exactly the same. Faithful outsiders to be in God's service upon salvation and judgment. But you see, those two thoughts are close enough together that he's repeating something. So those are your bookends, and those are great messages in and of themselves, right? That outsiders can be faithful and be part of God's service when they get saved. I don't think Jews took that seriously, because when Paul said he was preaching to the Gentiles, that's when they wanted to kill him, right? And when he even quotes that verse from Isaiah, he quotes that the servant was going to be a light to the Gentiles. Luke writes it in his gospel. It's one of the prophetic words that comes to John the Baptist or the birth of Jesus, that he's a light to the Gentiles. Yeah, so here's our letter B. Confronting the faithless insiders rather, with judgment and assuring the faithful with salvation. So just think of this now. These verses are just before the other verses, right? So the first thought is faithful outsiders going to be called into service. But now he's talking about confronting faithless insiders with judgment and assuring the faithful with salvation. You see the contrast that he's making. You got outsiders becoming part of the faithful. They're coming into service. But now he's confronting the insiders who don't have faith with judgment. And judgment back then wasn't, just a reprimand. It meant that they were going to get taken into captivity. They were going to get dislodged from their life. Either that or they were going to get killed.
It's reminiscent of Jesus' address to his hometown.
Yeah.
Right? They want to kill him. He's going to go to the Gentiles. Name an Assyrian.
Yeah.
They didn't like it.
No. No, and again, you think of the Jews that Jesus was talking to, if we call that second temple Judaism, or that was the New Testament Jews that were there. Here Isaiah is talking to Jews that are in Israel 8 centuries or 7 centuries before Jesus comes. So there are two different cultures really going on here. These Jews that are in Jerusalem, they've already been in exile. I mean, in Capernaum, they've already been in exile and returned to the land. So they got a totally different idea. They think they're privileged now twice because not only were they the people of God, but God gave them access back into Jerusalem or Judaism, restored them. And they were so opposed to the Gentiles getting anything. They were totally opposed to them. That's why they would committed to the Sabbath. And it was almost like Jesus just knew that he could just like stick his finger in their eye all the time about the Sabbath. Just heals on the Sabbath. They eat on the Sabbath because he was the Sabbath.
So they were God's chosen people, but they took that as a very prideful thing, and that the Gentiles were dogs or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, what you were saying last week, I heard you say that they were the chosen people because Jesus came from their heritage, their
Right.
lineage.
Yeah. The Jews the Israelites, they misused God's purpose their whole history. They never saw it for what it was. They never saw the connection with Abraham and the Garden of Eden. They never saw their heritage as God's answer to be the people that were going to bring the one who crushes the serpent's head. They thought they were special. And they thought that they had privilege because of that. And that was the issue. That they
So they said the seed of the woman. That was a singular seed,
yeah.
correct?
That's what Paul says in Galatians. He says, and to the seed, that is Christ. So Paul even interprets that for us in Galatians. The seed isn't the Jews, which is what they said that they were. And yeah, and that's why you have to turn that picture around. That it's not Jesus has a plan for me, because then it'll be about me. Then it's all about me. Paul said that he was willing to suffer for Christ. That should be part of our conversion confession, right? Because that's a possibility. There are people all over the world that die for Jesus every day. We're just skirting it right now. We're escaping it. We get upset when someone takes away some of our quote unquote rights. Very different picture. Yeah. Okay. If we go straight through with this, we'll end early. So go to the next one. You're all clear?
Yeah.
All right. So letter C deals with prayer for forgiveness and restoration. So that's really in those 6 or 7 verses in the first part, longer in the second part. It's basically a prayer for salvation. Yeah. Now we're getting close to the end here. So letter D, basically, it says the first part is the warrior king judges the wicked and redeems the repentant. The second part is the warrior king judges and saves the nations, which is just another way of saying the same thing. He judges the wicked and redeems the repentant. Second one is he judges and saves the nation. You see, he's building this picture here. This is how God is going to treat the nations and treat people, and he's active in all of this. Now it's not Assyria coming and being his tool or Babylon coming and being his tool. Now God is acting. He's the one doing the action. So this is that last mountain of those four mountains that we had, whether he was speaking to his own time, whether he was speaking to the exile, whether he was speaking about Jesus. Now he's looking at this is the end times. This is the last days that he's doing. So he's he's battling against those things. So finally, this is it. This is the point that he's going at. It's Zion's international renown amid King Yahweh's glory and his messenger. So that's the point of the whole thing. This is the mountain of the house of the Lord being raised above all the other mountains. So it becomes worldwide. It's international. That what God is doing on the earth is going to be seen everywhere. This is what Numbers says, as surely as I live, the knowledge of the Lord will fill the whole earth. Is the same echo or prophetic word that God has spoken all along. This is what's going to happen. And you remember that was when Israel, the spies came back, and 10 of them said, "We can't go in there. They're giants. We became like grasshoppers. They'll kill our children." And God wanted to wipe them all out. And Moses said, "Don't wipe them out." And the two, Joshua and Caleb, were the ones who said, "We can do this. God's with us." And God, sent them back into the wilderness for another 30 something years. He said, "As surely as I live, the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea." So there it is. He's saying it right there. This is the same picture that he says there, that this transfers over to Isaiah's prophecy. This is what he's going to get. This is what he's getting at in the whole prophetic word. It all leads up to this idea, and this is in chapter 60 to 62. In these verses, this is where Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." He's announcing the kingdom. This is chapter 61 of Isaiah. So it's in that he's talking about this is the gospel message right here. Zion is another name for Jerusalem.
So does that ever apply? Does that name ever apply to Christians today?
Only in Hebrews. Hebrews in chapter 12, he talks about you've come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Yeah. So all of those names are pictures of the church, of the company of people that have committed themselves to follow Jesus. Yeah.
But not in
Yeah. The Old Testament eclipses, the New Testament rather eclipses the Old Testament. It overshadows it. It basically blocks it out in a sense of all of those things that happen. Paul says they happen to them as an example, but instruction for us. He says it twice. He says it in Romans and Corinthians. He says everything that happened to them happened as an example. In other words, they disobeyed. This is what God did to them. Happened to them as an example, but it's for us as it's instruction. So we should learn not to do that. Don't do that. That's a no-no right there. And so Zion becomes a code word for the future people of God. And that is us, yeah. But the Old Testament is basically a picture. All of those words become code words for us when we see them being spoken prophetically. There are probably 5 major views differing views of the end times. You know, you have premillennial dispensationalists, you have postmillennial preterists sometimes, the partial preterist postmillennials. Yeah, mid-trib, post-trib. You have all different. Then you have people like me who say, I'm millennial. I think the millennium started when Jesus rose from the dead, and it's going to end when he comes again. And this is all we're living in the already, but not yet. You really have to. I'm thinking of Jeremiah 29. You know, I have a plan for you. You know, people put that on. They embroider it on pillowcases. They have it set in the, but they don't read the other verses in Jeremiah where he says, you know, I'm going to kick the snot out of you if you don't do this. I should embroider one of them on a pillowcase, you know, just because he's talking to the same people. But yeah, and on the other side, flip the pillow over. Depends how your life is going that day. Just he's talking. Jeremiah's prophesying to the Lord, speaking to a people in exile in the fifth century before Jesus comes, and so you have to see. I would rather take God works all things together for good to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. To me, that would be a better one because it is more propositional and it's in the New Testament and it's Paul's summation of the way he believes God works. He works all things together for the it doesn't say he causes all things, but he causes things to work together for you. Right? So to those who love him and those who are called according to his purpose. Right? And what does that mean? There's no time frame on that. It's not right away. It's not tomorrow. But I'd rather take that verse than the one in Jeremiah, because the one in Jeremiah, the way I see it is, it's got sticky on it, you know, and it's stuck on the people in in exile, and it's hard to get it out from there and say, oh yeah, this is for us. It's not like where chapter 31 where it talks about a new covenant. You know that well you have more than echoes of that in the New Testament. You have basically Jesus saying, quoting that, saying, "This is the new covenant," so that you can embrace. Um, so it's hard to, again, you have to see those. You know, who's he talking to, or what does this refer to? Um, and you got to keep a notebook for those things to just kind of see, does this play out in the New Testament? And unless you understand the Old Testament, I don't think you understand half the New Testament, because their Bible was the Old Testament. New Testament writers only had one Bible, and it was the Old Testament. So everything that they're writing about is found back there. You know, Jesus said, "These things have been written about me in the law and the prophets and the writings." You know, so you have a very different perspective of it. So this these chapters are really they are the point of what Isaiah's prophecy is all about. 60 to 62. This is the revelation of what God is about. This is what he's going to do with his people. And Paul, you know, you could say Paul picks this up in Ephesians chapter 3, where he talks about the manifold wisdom of God being manifested to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. So you get a little bit of an echo here. You say, does this refer to that? You know, because an eschatology word or a phrase in Ephesians. It talks about that this is what God is doing with the church. That's why Paul was preaching to the Gentiles so that he could tell them the riches of Christ and God's plan that includes the Gentiles. And here we are 2,000 years later trying to pin the tail on the Antichrist. Yeah, especially when you look at those, the mountaintop things or the mountain range, basically, that the things that Jesus is saying in Isaiah here, you see it through his life, because he stands up in the synagogue and says the Spirit of he says he turns to the place or finds the place in Isaiah where this is written. It says the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, right? Goes through that whole thing. He says, today what? This scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. So 2,000 years ago, bingo, this is where it starts, right? This is not for a future age. This is for that age coming right down through the centuries. And so you just see how it refers to us all along. And when we receive Jesus, we step into that kingdom, right? Because he's the king, we become followers of the king. Yeah, and then you see, you have to realize, again, you're seeing mountaintops or you're looking at a mountain range. And so that mountain over there might be 100 years or 1,000 years past these mountains we're looking here. You don't know where that fits in the plan of God.
What's the New Jerusalem?
The New Jerusalem, oh gosh, without a blackboard. The New Jerusalem becomes the city of God, right? That's the Isaiah, Revelation 21 and 22. New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. What does Paul say to the Galatians? He says, you're not of the earthly Jerusalem, they're enslaved. The heavenly Jerusalem, they are free. That's what we are, right? And John, in his Revelation, sees the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And if you read those things, that's apocalyptic literature. And what he's saying is that there's no sun, there's no moon there, because God's the light. Right? Now, metaphor, it's a picture. And the measurements are basically of a cube, 1,500 miles tall, 1,500 miles wide, 1,500 miles long. The only other cube that's mentioned in Scripture is the Holy of Holies. What lived in the Holy of Holies? It was God's dwelling place. So the city comes down, and the voice says, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. Whoa, we're the New Jerusalem. He dwells with us now. And in the future, this all becomes reality. When we get past this life, we go into that next life. These things become more. Right now, Paul says we see through a glass darkly. We're not seeing it as clearly as we should see it, but one day we will see it. Yeah, we see him face to face. All the secrets become clear. This is good stuff. This is like, I'm not making this stuff up. You realize that this is, yeah. See, what we have to do is realize that it's great sitting here, you're hearing it, you're thinking, this is wonderful, and you go out and you got to live in the mess. But you have to think, what's my identity? Yeah, Christ in me, the hope of glory. It all fits together. The Bible fits together wonderfully. You just find the right path through it and just realize all these verses converge together, all these ideas come together. It's all about Jesus. The whole Bible is the story of the incarnation. That is what the Bible is about. It's not about Israel. It's not about the millennium. It's not about the enemies of God. It's about the incarnation, God becoming flesh. and dwelling among. That's what the whole Bible is about. That's the story of the Bible. It starts in the garden. The seed of the woman is going to crush your head. And no other person could do it before Jesus came. He's the key to understanding the scripture. Becomes simple once you see it. You realize all this other stuff is stuff. Yeah, that's right. Distractions. Yeah. I have to say that probably if I add up all the questions I get online, I would say a fifth of them are all about end times. Do you think the end times is near? I have no idea. Jesus, this is the verse I always quote back to them. No man knows the time, neither do I. And I've not seen I've not seen a chart that made me think like, oh yeah, this is it. I have one friend who says, if you want to know what God's doing, just look at Israel. And I thought, oh gosh, that's like the worst advice you could ever give anybody. What are they doing? Enslaving the right Palestinians? Where does this fit? What about the Palestinians that are Christians? Yeah. All right. So hopefully you get a little bit of a better handle on Isaiah. I think he's probably the most profound writer in the Old Testament. I think his revelation of the end times and, dealing with real literally people who would hook you through the jaw to lead you astray, lead you back to their, this is what the Assyrians did and the Babylonians did when they took you prisoner. If they didn't kill you, they were going to take you as a slave. Basically, they hooked you up the way they would hook up an animal and just led you astray like that. Or led you away, basically. The fears of the people were not like, oh gosh, the economy's going to get ruined. The dollar's not going to be worth what it used to be. They're talking about they're going to separate children from their parents, husbands from their wives, and just send you all over the place, basically making sure you were never going to rise up against them. That's what the Assyrians did. That's where all the synagogues came from, all over the world. The Greek world was because the Assyrians sowed Jews all over the place. It's called a diaspora. And so they were having these synagogues in all these major Roman towns, and it fit right in with the gospel. When Paul comes, he finds Jews in all these major cities. You think, yeah. Paul says, in the fullness of time, Christ died for the ungodly. So this is the end of our study on the book of Isaiah, and hope that God has spoken to you through it and get a better handle on the book. A flyover just gives you all the way the lay of the land is, and you've got to go and check out whether or not it fits with everything else that's there. So my prayer is that you will study Isaiah, that you will buy some books and get some understanding, more than what I've covered in these 5 short lessons. Now, I've done a bit of editing with the tape, with the videos, just because some of the sound was really poor, didn't get questions, and I didn't repeat questions, something I'm not great at. But I trust that it'll still be cogent enough for you to understand what I was saying and what we were discussing.